Imagine dying in medieval England and discovering that your journey to heaven depended on a stranger eating bread off your corpse. Yes, there was once a real man whose job was to consume other people's sins by literally eating food placed on dead bodies. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't respected. In fact, most people were terrified of him. They needed him, but they also believed he was cursed tonight. We're diving into one of the strangest lost professions in history, the life of the medieval sin eater, the man paid to carry your guilt into his own grave. Stay with me as we explore how this ritual worked, why people truly believed in it, and what happened to the last sin eater who died with decades of stolen sins trapped inside him. The story of the sin eater is one of those peculiar fragments of medieval life that seems almost impossible to believe today. And yet it lingers in half-forgotten records, in travel journals, in church condemnations, and in the hushed folklore of the borderlands between England and Wales. It was not a myth, nor a superstition invented centuries later by romantic imaginations. It was a real practice, recorded by observers in the 17th and 18th centuries, and whispered about by villagers who would never dream of taking part themselves, but who also would not dare to die without it. To understand why such a strange ritual existed, you must first understand the anxieties of a medieval world where religion permeated every part of life, where death was always near, and where salvation was never guaranteed. For an ordinary villager in late medieval Europe, death was not just the end of life, but the beginning of a perilous passage. The church taught that sins must be confessed and absolved through a priest before one could enter heaven. For those who died without confession, whether suddenly, violently, or with unconfessed wrongs lingering, there was the threat of purgatory, or worse, eternal damnation. Yet priests were not always present in remote villages. Death often came at odd hours, with little warning. And though prayers and masses could be said after the fact, the fear remained that the soul still carried its burden. It was in this atmosphere of constant uncertainty that the figure of the sin eater emerged, a man whose task was to consume bread and drink placed upon the body of the deceased, thereby symbolically absorbing their sins into himself. The image is stark. A corpse laid out on a simple table in a cottage. The mourners gathered in silence, and at the center of the ritual, not a priest, but a man of low standing, often shunned in daily life, who stooped to pick up a piece of bread from the chest of the dead and ate it slowly, as though chewing on guilt itself. Payment was given in the form of coins, sometimes food or ale, and the exchange was simple. In return for a few bites of bread, the family could believe their loved one had been freed of spiritual weight. The sin eater himself became a kind of vessel, a repository for the wrongdoings of others, doomed to carry them until his own death. The origins of the practice are obscure. Some scholars suggest that it grew out of pre-Christian traditions, remnants of pagan rites where food offerings to the dead were common. Others argue that it was an improvised folk remedy to the shortcomings of the institutional church, a desperate invention by villagers who needed certainty in matters of the soul. The first written references appear in the Welsh Marsh, those borderlands where English and Welsh customs blended and overlapped. The marshes were full of half-Christianized superstitions, rituals that the church tried to stamp out, but which clung stubbornly to local belief. By the time travelers in the 16th and 17th centuries wrote about sin eating, it was already considered an old custom, passed down from earlier generations. One account from the 1680s describes a Herefordshire sin eater hired for a funeral. He arrived at the cottage, sat by the corpse, and was given bread and ale, which he consumed in full view of the mourners. The witness noted how the villagers seemed to both fear and despise him, refusing to speak to him except for this ritual purpose. He was necessary, yet untouchable. Once his grim meal was finished, he slipped away without thanks, his presence lingering like a shadow. This was the paradox of the sin eater, essential at the moment of death, avoided in life, to imagine his existence. One must picture not a single figure, but a succession of men often poor, often marginalized, perhaps widowed or living alone, with little other means of support. They were not priests, not trained theologians, not respected officials. They were men for whom this role was both livelihood and curse. In some cases, they may have been beggars, taking up the task when no one else would. In other cases, they might have inherited the role, as families came to associate one household with the ritual. Whatever their origin, they occupied a peculiar space in society, part of the community yet set apart, spoken of in whispers, called upon only in the silence of death. Their work was not without risk. The church condemned the practice as heretical. To claim that sins could be transferred through bread and drink was to usurp the role of confession and absolution, which belonged solely to ordained clergy. Priests railed against the sin-eater as a fraud, a dangerous pagan holdover, a man who could not truly help the soul of the deceased. Yet ordinary people clung to the ritual because it felt tangible. Unlike the distant prayers of the church, this was immediate, physical, and visible. You could see the bread taken from the corpse. You could watch the man chew. You could believe in that moment that the sins had been carried away. Imagine the psychological weight placed upon such a man. Each funeral added another layer of wrongs that were not his own. Each meal was not sustenance, but contamination. Villagers believed he carried these sins within him, and so they treated him as dangerous, polluted. He could walk through the market and people would avert their eyes. He might be given food or coins, but no companionship. Children were told to keep their distance, as though his very shadow carried corruption. To live as a sin-eater was to be condemned to solitude, your only conversations held with the dead. What did such men think in the long hours between rituals? Did they believe in their own power, or did they see it as a necessary trick played for survival? Perhaps some convinced themselves that they were performing a sacred duty, a grim but holy service. Others may have been indifferent, treating it as mere transaction. But whatever they thought, the role shaped their lives in ways no one else could imagine. They bore the burden not just of symbolic sins, but of social exile. They became, in effect, scapegoats, absorbing the guilt of others and suffering ostracism in return. Accounts of sin-eating are rare but consistent. The ritual always involves bread, sometimes cheese, sometimes ale or cider. The food is laid on the chest or near the body, and the sin-eater consumes it in silence. Payment is made, and he departs. Some records note that he muttered a formula as he ate, words that sounded like half prayer, half incantation. Others suggest he remained silent, letting the act itself suffice. No church bells rang for him. No priest blessed him. His very presence was an uncomfortable reminder that the church's authority was not absolute, that folk belief still carved its own path through the routines of death. By the 17th and 18th centuries, as literacy spread and more travelers recorded what they saw, the sin-eater became a curiosity for outsiders. Writers described him with a mixture of fascination and horror. They marveled that such a figure could exist in Christian Europe, in sight of the church steeple, yet outside its blessing. To them, the sin-eater seemed like a living contradiction, a man of the people, yet despised by the people. A figure meant to cleanse, yet himself forever stained. The last recorded sin-eater is said to have lived in Shropshire in the early 19th century. His funeral was noted with irony. No one dared perform the ritual for him, and so he went to his grave burdened with decades of inherited sin. Perhaps he expected no better. Perhaps he accepted his fate with the same resignation that had marked his entire life. But his death marked not just the end of a man but the fading of a custom. As church authority strengthened and society modernized, folk rituals like sin-eating dwindled. It was no longer needed in the same way. Priests were more accessible, theologies of grace shifted, and the community slowly let go of the old practice. Yet the memory lingered. Villagers still told stories of the man who ate sins, the shadow who passed through their cottages at the hour of death, and who left silently, carrying guilt that was not his own. To modern eyes, the sin eater can seem grotesque, even absurd. But to the people who employed him, he was deeply practical. He represented certainty in a world where certainty was rare. Death was constant, disease common, and salvation uncertain. In that moment, when a loved one lay dead, the family wanted assurance. The sin eater provided it, however temporary, however fragile. And so they paid him, fed him, and then shunned him, until the next funeral required his presence again. The practice reveals much about medieval and early modern society. It shows the persistence of folk belief alongside official religion. It shows the desperation of ordinary people for concrete rituals in the face of mortality. And it shows how individuals could be cast into roles that were both vital and cursed, sustaining themselves by shouldering the fears of others. The sin eater was not merely a curiosity. He was a symbol of the uneasy negotiation between faith and folk, between church doctrine and lived reality. One can imagine the heavy silence of those cottages, the flicker of firelight on rough walls, the smell of damp earth and wool, the mourners waiting as the sin eater chewed. For them, it was not entertainment, not legend, but the last necessary act of the funeral. Bread, ale, a few coins, and the uneasy relief that their loved one might rest easier. And when he left, they turned away, unable to face the man who now carried their dead sins within his own body. Today, the story of the sin eater survives mostly in folklore collections, in scattered references, in antiquarian notes scribbled down by curious travelers. Yet the figure lingers in the imagination because he embodies something universal: the human desire to pass away clean, to shed burdens before stepping into the unknown. The sin eater was a man who carried that desire for others, at great cost to himself. In his silence, in his isolation, in his thankless meals, he became an unlikely symbol of both human fear and human resilience. And though the custom has long since vanished, the question it poses remains timeless. Who, in the end, bears our burdens? Can guilt ever truly be transferred, or only shared? The villagers believed it could be eaten, swallowed, carried away by another. Whether or not they were right, the ritual gave them peace. And in a world of hardship and death, peace of mind was worth more than gold. The sin eater was not a legend. He was a man, trudging from cottage to cottage, summoned only when death arrived, consuming bread heavy with symbolism, and then disappearing again into the margins of society. He lived and died unknown, yet his role tells us more about the medieval world than the deeds of kings and knights. For history is not only the story of rulers, but of the quiet figures who stood in the shadows of life and death, doing work that no one else would do, carrying burdens no one else would carry. This is his story, not glorious, not triumphant, but deeply human. A life lived on the edges, sustained by the fears of others, condemned for the very service he provided, and remembered now only as the man who ate sins. Thank you for staying with me through this quiet journey into one of history's strangest traditions. If your eyes are getting heavy, or your mind has drifted somewhere softer than where we began, then I've done my job here on Quiet Boring Sleep. I tell the stories that textbooks skip, not the glorious battles or heroic kings, but the quiet, uncomfortable parts of history that somehow feel closer to real life than anything else. If you'd like to hear more forgotten tales like this one, whispered slowly across time, please take a moment, when you're awake enough, to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these sleepy stories travel even further. Rest well, dream gently, and remember, even the strangest souls of history deserve to be heard. Good night from Quiet Boring Sleep.